The power goes out in your building on a Tuesday night in February. 2 hours in, you're wearing your coat indoors, eating dry cereal straight out of the box by the light of your phone, doing grim math on how long the stuff in the fridge has left. By hour 3, you have described the situation to at least 3 separate people as an ordeal. That night is the closest thing you own to a reference point, and it's the one your brain quietly reaches for the second somebody says the words 40,000 years ago. You take that evening, subtract the coat and the cereal and the building, stretch it across an entire lifetime, add snow, and there it is. The ancient world. Cold, brown, thin, mostly empty. Our world minus everything. A long, grey waiting room where people shivered and gnawed on things until agriculture finally showed up and started the actual story. Nearly everyone walks around with some version of that picture. It's wrong in a way that turns out to be far more interesting than simply being wrong, because a few of the things that world had going for it are gone, and we are never getting them back. Start with a flute. In a cave in southern Germany called Geissenklösterle, archaeologists pulled up flutes carved out of mammoth ivory, dated to roughly 42,000 years ago. About 9 times further back than the oldest pyramid, and twice as far back as the coldest point of the Ice Age itself. Ivory is an awful material for a flute. It's solid. To get a tube out of a tusk, you have to split a section lengthwise using stone tools, hollow out both halves by hand, and then fit the 2 pieces back together tightly enough to hold air without leaking. Meanwhile, bird bones were lying around that landscape by the thousand. Bird bones are already hollow, which is nature handing you the finished product for free. The same people, in the same valleys, made bird bone flutes too. And those work perfectly well. They went with ivory anyway. The best explanation anybody has come up with is that ivory sounded better, deeper, richer. And the flutes weren't tucked away in some special chamber. They came out of ordinary living layers, burnt bone, flint chips, the general debris of people eating dinner and making tools. Instruments were part of the household junk. So before we compare anything else, adjust one setting in your head. In the middle of an ice age, somebody chose the brutally difficult version of a job because they didn't care for the tone of the easy one. Whatever that world was, it wasn't a waiting room. It was somebody's ordinary. And their ordinary had people in it who held strong opinions about timbre. Now, the land, because that's where your mental picture is most confidently wrong. The phrase Ice Age does most of the damage. It suggests a planet with the volume turned down. Less life, less color, less of everything. A white sheet pulled over the good parts. What actually decides whether a landscape is rich or poor isn't temperature though. It's grass. Grass feeds animals in bulk, and animals in bulk feed absolutely everything else. 40,000 years ago, there was one continuous grassland running from Spain across Europe, over Siberia, through the land bridge into Canada, and down toward northern China. A single connected biome, the largest on the planet at the time, and its name tells you exactly who was standing in it. The mammoth steppe. Cold and dry is a miserable combination for plants, so for a long stretch everyone assumed that steppe was scrubby, half-dead country. Then researchers working in the Siberian permafrost started counting bones. Frozen soil preserves skeletons in numbers that make the counting a career rather than an afternoon, and skeleton density in a known volume of ground tells you roughly how much animal weight that ground was carrying. The counts came back showing animal biomass and plant productivity close to an African savanna. The coldest, driest grassland on Earth was running at Serengeti settings. It helps to name the tenants. Woolly mammoths, steppe bison, wild horses in herds, woolly rhinos, musk oxen, reindeer, saiga. Predators shadowing all of it. Wolves, hyenas, and the European cave lion, a foot taller than a modern African lion, and carrying no mane at all, so you didn't even get the courtesy of a recognizable silhouette. You're standing on it. Wind, constantly, from one direction. Hard, dry ground and grass to the horizon every way you turn, and on that horizon, animals. Not out there as an event, and not something anyone bothers pointing at. They're a permanent condition of the ground you live on, the way traffic is a permanent condition of a street. Living on top of that much protein came with its own problems, and they were not the problems you'd guess. Bring down a mammoth, and you have just acquired several tons of meat, nowhere on Earth to put it, and roughly 48 hours before the smell starts advertising your position to every predator inside 10 miles, including a lion with no mane and outstanding hearing. Abundance was a logistics job, a brutal one on a deadline, and the animals were the reason it stayed that way. Heavy grazing, trampling, and manure kept grasses ahead of moss and shrub year after year, and the grass kept the herds fed. The herds were maintaining the lawn they were eating. When the big animals disappeared at the end of the Ice Age, moss and shrub moved in, the soil went wetter and colder, and the whole system tipped into the version we have now. Those latitudes today are tundra. Thin soil, low scrub, a caribou herd every few hundred miles. The rich addition of the North isn't hiding somewhere waiting to be found. It ended. The reason every sweeping grassland documentary gets filmed in East Africa is that East Africa is the last working fragment of an ecosystem that used to cover the entire top of the world. The map was different too. With that much water locked into ice sheets, the sea sat far below where it sits now. Low enough that the floor of the southern North Sea was open ground with rivers running across it. Britain wasn't an island. You could walk from what's now France to what's now England without getting your feet wet, across a landscape that currently has fishing trawlers on top of it. It wasn't the frozen hellscape of the mental picture either. Modeling of the coldest phase of the last glaciation, considerably colder than the period we're talking about, still leaves better than a third of Europe inside the range where humans can comfortably live. Cold, sure. Uninhabitable, no. And for a person living on it, that's what all of this actually measures. Not scenery, calories, hides, sinew, bone, fat, antler, ivory. The entire supply chain, walking around on 4 legs, in numbers a bad year could dent but not empty. They lived inside the most biologically loaded landscape any human being has ever walked through, and nothing we've got comes close to competing. It was, in fairness, a grocery store that occasionally hunted you back. None of which made it a good place to be a person. Everyone knows they died young, and unlike most of what everyone knows about this era, that one is true. It deserves better handling than it usually gets though, because the famous number hides what's going on underneath it. Pool the mortality records from foraging, and small-scale societies around the world, and life expectancy at birth clusters around 30 years. 30. That's the figure that gets quoted, and it's real. The shape of the curve is where it stops meaning what you assume. In those same populations, adult death rates stay low all the way to about 40 before they start climbing, and the most common age of death for an adult who reached adulthood lands somewhere in the late 60s to late 70s. Making it to your 70s wasn't a freak occurrence. Grandparents were ordinary. A band of 30 people with 3 or 4 grey-haired members in it, telling long stories the young ones had already heard, twice with the same pauses in the same places, is the normal composition of a group, not a sentimental invention. So where does 30 come from then? The very start of life. That average is pulled down by how many people never got past their first few years. And in their world, that was a constant rather than a tragedy with a name. It's the one part of this comparison that refuses to be a fun fact, so I'll leave it where it is. What was doing the killing, most of the time, wasn't dramatic either. Across those populations, illness accounts for something like 70% of deaths. Not predators, not hunger, infection. A cut on the shin that goes wrong. Something in the water. A fever that shows up on a Wednesday and takes a healthy 26-year-old by the weekend. And there was nothing anybody could do about it. No antibiotic, and no concept that the thing killing him was alive and had come in through his leg. Being clever didn't help, and being tough helped even less. These were people who could track an animal for 2 days across open ground and light a fire in a crosswind, and the entire apparatus of that intelligence had exactly nothing to offer a bacterial infection. You have almost certainly had an infection this year that would have been a coin flip in their world. You called it a sinus thing, complained about it in a group chat, and took a pill with a name you didn't attempt out loud. The whole event cost you about $11 and one moderately annoying afternoon. We win this column by a distance that makes the scoreboard look broken, and it's the one to keep in your pocket for later, when the rest of this starts making their world sound like somewhere you'd book a trip to. Whatever finally beat the leading cause of death of the Ice Age, it wasn't a better spear, or a wall, or a bigger group. It was soap, clean water, and a mold somebody noticed behaving oddly on a dish. That leaves one thing, and it's where the comparison quietly falls apart in your hands. Right now, today, the word human points at exactly one thing. Every person you've met, argued with, been stuck behind in traffic, or fallen in love with belongs to a single species. There's no second kind. That fact is so total and so stable that you've never once had to hold it in your head as a fact. It's just the shape of the room. 40,000 years ago, it was not the shape of the room. Neanderthals were still in Europe right around then, in the same valleys, hunting the same animals with comparable skill. Not a rough draft of anybody. A different build, a different face, and by every indication, a full working life to go with it. Spread across Asia were the denisovans, who we know mostly from DNA rather than bones. A whole population of people represented by a couple of finger bones, some teeth, and an entire genome, which is a strange way to meet somebody. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, there were people roughly a meter tall, a separate species entirely, hanging on until perhaps 50,000 years ago. On Luzon in the Philippines, another one. Depending on which anthropologist you ask, and how generous they're feeling about classification that morning, you land on 4, 5, 6 kinds of humans sharing one planet. That's the taxonomy, and taxonomy is the boring way in. From inside a life, it looked like this. In a cave in Romania called Peștera cu Oase, someone found a jawbone about 40,000 years old. Modern human, no argument. Then the DNA came out of it, and between 6 and 9% of that man's genome traced back to Neanderthals, more than any other human ever sequenced, living or dead. The Neanderthal stretches in his chromosomes were long too, and length is the part that does the work. Inherited DNA gets chopped into smaller pieces every generation, so segment length runs like a clock. His had barely been touched. Svante Pääbo, whose lab did the sequencing, put the finding in the plainest terms available. This man had a Neanderthal ancestor 4 to 6 generations back. A great-great-grandparent, give or take. Somebody in his family married a different species of human, and it was recent enough to still be gossip. He wouldn't have found any of that worth mentioning. He had relatives on the other side. Different build, different face, different voice, presumably a whole set of habits his in-laws found irritating, and a couple nobody said out loud at dinner. Meeting a person who wasn't your kind of person was a Tuesday. You're on one side of a valley in their world. There are people on the far side, working along the river, and you can see from the way they move that they're not your people. Heavier, shorter, a different rhythm to how they carry things. You're not amazed. Nobody has ever told you this arrangement is unusual, because it isn't. You're just standing there, working out whether it's worth the walk. The traffic went both directions, and it left marks that are still on you. Everyone with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carries somewhere between 1 and 3% Neanderthal DNA. If your family line runs through New Guinea or Aboriginal Australia, you're carrying a meaningful chunk of denisovan on top of that. From a population we know almost entirely through those few finger bones and teeth. You are, in a small and completely literal sense, still hosting the in-laws. And then, inside a window a few thousand years wide, all of it closes. The Neanderthals go. The denisovans go. The small people on Flores go. Whatever mix of climate, competition, bad luck and thin numbers did it, the argument is still running, and the outcome isn't in dispute. One kind of human comes out the other side, it's us. There's nothing to put opposite that. It isn't that they beat us on it. It's that our side of it is empty. Line all of this up, and a shape shows up that's more interesting than any single piece of it. Everything they had going for them sat outside the skin. The land, the animals, the sheer number of other kinds of mind in the world. Everything we've got sits inside it. Infection, childbirth, the cut on the shin. We didn't defeat their world. We stepped out of it. We traded a spectacularly rich and spectacularly dangerous outside for a controlled, survivable inside. And that trade was worth making. Nobody sane is arguing otherwise. A trade has two sides though, and the second side never went to a vote. And there were so few of them. Modeling of the human population of Europe around 30,000 years ago puts the total near 330,000 people. That's everyone. The entire continent. Fewer human beings than currently live in one mid-sized city, scattered in thin bands across a landmass groaning with animals. And some of that handful were sitting down with a stone blade and a length of mammoth tusk to carve a standing figure with the head of a cave lion. A job somebody has since reproduced using period tools and clocked at over 400 hours. 400 hours in a world where a splinter could still take you out. Today, Europe holds about 750 million people, and the animals are in parks with gift shops. Across 40,000 years, we and everything else swapped places. Our numbers climbed by a factor that doesn't fit comfortably in a sentence, and the living world thinned out behind us until it fits in reserves. The other kinds of humans didn't swap anything. They just stopped. The grassland, in principle, is recoverable. There are people in Siberia trying it right now, fencing in bison and horses to see whether heavy grazing brings the old system back. Herds can grow. Land can be handed over. The other people can't be. And that's the loss nobody was tracking, because the thing we lost belongs to a category that doesn't have a name anymore. You talk to your dog. Full sentences, proper grammar, a question mark at the end, and then a pause. A real one, where you actually wait. You know the dog isn't going to answer. You do it several times a day anyway, for your entire life, and so does everybody else you know. We're the only species on Earth that has to do this. You thank a machine that read your card. You give the car a name and an attitude. You explain your reasoning out loud to a houseplant that has never once weighed in. We build systems for the specific purpose of having something answer back. We aim radio dishes at stars on the odds that somebody out there might be listening, and we run careful experiments to work out whether a crow understands what we mean, then get strangely emotional when the answer comes back looking like yes. 40,000 years ago, that itch had somewhere to go. There were other kinds of people right there, over the next ridge, sharing your winter, and your mammoth, and occasionally your family. That was their world, and it wasn't a thinner version of ours. It was a fuller one. The man in that Romanian cave never had to talk to a dog and wait. If they were still here, not a cousin species in a documentary, but actual other people who simply aren't us, do you think we'd have made room? Tell me in the comments.